Hi everyone, I've decided to record a little video about my recent work about adaptive efficient coding of numerosity in human parietal cortex. This presentation will be very similar to what I presented at the Society for Neuroeconomics in last October. Okay, so most of the decisions that we make on the basis of the brain's internal representation of external variables. So for instance, here you have a variable out there, x, so maybe it's a quantity or a price or a distance, something like that. And it will elicit in the brain some internal representation. And based on this representation, you will make a decision. And so because virtually all decisions are based on this kind of representation, I think it is fundamental to understand what this representation looks like. Of course, we already know a few things or two about the brain's internal representation of external variables. And so first, we know that in many cases, the representation is distributed across many neurons that have bell-shaped tuning curves like this one, and that together define an important component of the neural code. And second, we know that many sensory systems seem to obey the principle of efficient coding. And so efficient coding is this prominent idea that prescribes that the neural code should depend on the statistics of the encoded stimulus. So what it means is that the parameters, so to speak, of these tuning curves, including, for instance, their preferred stimuli, and how these preferred stimuli are distributed across stimulus space, well, this parameter should depend on the statistics of the encoded stimulus. And so, for instance, you will want to have more neurons tuned to the stimuli that occur more frequently. But in many situations, the statistics of the decision-relevant variables change across time and across context. And so, for instance, if you think of prices, the prices that you will see in the grocery store will be different than the kind of prices you will see if you're looking to buy a new laptop or something like that. So the natural question is, in those cases, do the neural representations change too, and do they change in a way that implement efficient coding? So put differently, the question is efficient coding dynamic? And to investigate this question, we run a numerosity estimation task. And so in every trial in this experiment, the participant is presented with a cloud of dots like this one, and for just half a second, so it's pretty quick. And then they are asked to provide their best estimate of the number of dots in the cloud. And so to be clear, here the external variable that is relevant for our decision is the number of dots. And so the decision to be made is the best estimate of dots. And we're interested in the internal representation of this number. And so this is why we conduct this study in an MRI scanner. So this is a fMRI study. And so, as I said, we're interested in how the internal representations depend on the statistics of the relevant variables. So we're going to have two experimental conditions in this task. So there will be a narrow condition in which, so these two conditions differ by the prior distribution from which the number of dots is sampled. And so with the narrow prior, the number of dots is sampled from this narrow prior. So all the clouds of dots will have between 10 and 25 dots. And in the wide condition, the number of dots is sampled from this wider range. And in fact, this range is twice as wide as the range of the narrow prior. And this factor of 2 will become important in what's coming. Okay, so these are the two conditions, and so under this idea of dynamic efficient coding, well, the encoding resources will be allocated to a wider range of numbers in the wide condition. So this neural resource is going to be like spread out over a wider range, and so in that case, you should expect a greater imprecision with the wider prior, because in some sense there are less neurons per number to encode each number. And just looking at the behavior, so we look at the standard deviation of responses in the two conditions, and we find indeed that the responses are less precise in the context of the wide prior as compared to the narrow prior. So this is not new. This replicates existing results, but it's behavioral evidence for this dynamic, adaptive, efficient coding. And so now we're interested in the neural substrate of this. And so we're going to make the hypothesis that the change in behavioral variability that I just presented reflects changes in the neural code. And the hypothesis that these neural changes implement efficient coding. And so more specifically, we're going to formulate a hypothesis regarding how the neural code changes from one prior to the other. And this hypothesis I call distributed range adaptation. So what is distributed range adaptation? Well, imagine that in the context of the narrow prior, you have these neural populations that are characterized by their preferred stimuli. And so here their preferred stimuli cover the range of the narrow prior. And the hypothesis of distributed range adaptation is that these preferred stimuli of this neural population will shift when going from the narrow prior to the wide prior, but they will shift in such a way that they will correspond to the same quantiles across priors. And so what it means that, for instance, the greenish receptive fields here, the greenish preferred stimulus that corresponds to roughly the midpoint of the narrow prior will correspond in the context of the wide prior to the midpoint of the wide range. And so this shift we call efficient shift, as they essentially implement efficient coding in that the same neural resources are spread out in the wide condition to cover the wide prior. And and so this is, maybe you've heard about range adaptation in the context of monotonic tuning curves. And so here it's a similar idea, but it requires a coherent and collective adjustment of the whole encoding network. And so this hypothesis makes a specific prediction as to how the preferred numerosities of each neural population in the wide condition should relate to their preferred numerosity in the narrow condition. And because the two priors in the two conditions are uniform and one is twice as wide as the other one, this relationship will be a linear relationship. So between the preferred numerosity in the wide condition and the preferred numerosity in the narrow condition. So if you plot one versus the other, you should be on this line here of slope 2, if indeed you have this efficient shift, and you should be on this identity line if there is no shift. So the question is, do we observe this? And so now I'm turning to the fMRI data. And so specifically, we're going to look in the numerical parietal cortex, which is a region of the intraparietal sulcus that has been identified in previous studies as being particularly rich in number-sensitive populations. And so we're going to fit models of numerical population receptive fields to the single trial ball responses of each voxel. And so you can think of these population receptive fields as essentially population level tuning curves or voxel level tuning curve. And so what it means that the activity of each voxel is modeled as a bell-shaped function of the presented number, parameterized by several parameters, but in particular by its preferred numerosity and its width. And I will start by talking about the preferred numerosity. And so doing so, you obtain this beautiful topographic map. So this is for one subject in the context of the narrow prior. And so here each voxel is color-coded as a function of its preferred numerosity. And so you can see that, for instance, this patch over there is greenish, which means that the neural populations in this area are tuned to numbers around 15, roughly. So this is in context of the narrow prior. But now if we look at the wide prior, we see that the colors have changed, and they've changed toward the warmer colors. So essentially the preferred numerosity of those neural populations have shifted toward larger numbers. And so this area over there is now yellow and red. So now it means that these neural populations are now tuned to larger numbers around 20, 25. So it seems that there is indeed a shift toward larger numbers. So we can have a closer look at that, and we can look, as I said, at the preferred numerosity for each of these populations in the wide condition versus its preferred numerosity in the narrow condition. And so if we have this efficient shift, we should be here on this line of slope 2, and if there were no shifts, we would be here on this the identity line. And so the data is more consistent with the former hypothesis. And so here this main panel pulls together all the voxels of all the subjects, but this is a pattern that we observe very consistently across all the participants. So we can go a bit further than that and do a model comparison and to essentially test this hypothesis. And so to do that, we're going to fit different models that make different assumptions on the preferred numerosities of each neural population in the two conditions. And so so we do this, we make different assumptions and we fit different models, and then we report the proportions of voxels with positive cross-validated variance explained, which is essentially a measure of fit, cross-validated measure of fit of the model. And so we can have the assumption that the two preferred numerosities are independent. So this was the case for this model, for instance. But we can enforce the constraint that there should be no shifts, so the preferred numerosities are equal in the two conditions. Or we can look at a model that implements this efficient shift that I've talked about and that are implied by this idea of distributed range adaptation. And so we obtain like linear shift with the slope of 2, but we can also consider the possibility that each participant adapts differently to the context, to the prior. And so we have a model here in which this slope here is a participant-specific parameter. So each participant has a different value of the slope. And so this last model is interesting because we can look at the distribution of this parameter across participants, and we obtain a distribution that's centered around essentially 2, which is precisely the value implied by distributed range adaptation. And in fact, in terms of cross-validated fit, it will be simpler and better to simply assume that all the subjects follow the model of efficient shift with those linear shift with a slope of 2. So assuming this linear shift with the same slope for all the participants and precisely the slope implied by distributed range adaptation yields a better and more parsimonious account of the data. Okay, so this was about the shift of the preferred numerosity. And but we can also look at the width of those receptive fields and see whether and how they change across context. And so we do the same exercise. So we look at the width of the receptive field in the wide condition as a function of the width of the receptive field in the narrow condition. And so what we obtain is that the width in the wide condition is are proportional to the width in the narrow condition with a factor greater than 1. So essentially, the receptive fields widen in the wide condition. And this is also a pattern that we find very consistently across all the participants. We can do here the same exercise. I'm going to go a bit faster, but essentially what we find is that so the model in which so the width scale up from one prior to the other, but also with the same scaling factor for all the participants, yields a better and more parsimonious account of the data. So there is a strong homogeneity of these findings across participants, both for the preferred numerosities and for the width. And I think that this suggests that this is what we're looking at is just a standard mechanism of neural code adaptation to changing context. Okay, so to summarize so far, so we've seen that the receptive fields shift and spread out consistent with distributed range adaptation, and they also widen when going from one prior to the other. And so intuitively, this should reduce encoding precision because it means, once again, that the resources are more spread out across the number. And so that would be consistent with the dynamic implementation of efficient coding. And so we're going to test this more directly by estimating the neural imprecision in the two conditions. So to measure the neural imprecision, we're going to generate noisy neural responses from the encoding model that we have identified, and we're going to decode them into number estimates. And so we obtain distribution of fMRI-derived estimate, and so we can look at the standard deviation of this fMRI-derived estimate, just like we look at the standard deviation of the participant responses. And so this is what we obtain. So the standard deviation of this fMRI-derived number estimate is larger in the context of the wide prior than it is in the context of the narrow prior. And so the imprecision of the fMRI-derived estimate is larger in the wide condition, and that's consistent with what we obtain with the behavioral imprecision, and that is consistent with dynamic efficient coding. But we can go further than that. We can look at correlation of changes in the neural and the behavioral imprecision. And so the idea is that if the behavioral imprecision proceeds from the neural imprecision, then an increase across priors in the neural imprecision should correlate with an increase in the behavioral imprecision. And so to look at that, we're going to look at how much the imprecision change from one condition to the other. So we look at the difference in the standard deviation of responses in the wide versus the narrow condition. So this is as derived from the behavioral data for 4 subjects, and you see that there is some inter-subject variability. And so, for instance, subject 6 here has a larger change in behavioral imprecision across the priors than subject 28. And so this is just looking at behavior, so just looking at the responses. Now, if we look at the fMRI-derived responses, we obtain these 4 curves here for these 4 subjects, and so we recover this inter-subject variability, and in particular we recover their ordering. And so here also, just looking at the neural data, we find that the change in imprecision for subject 6 from one prior to the other is larger than the change in imprecision for subject 28. And so more generally, if we look at all the subject, we find a significant correlation between the change in imprecision as measured in the neural data and the change in imprecision as measured in the behavioral data. So the participants whose neural population show a larger loss of precision with the wide prior also show a greater decrease in behavioral precision. I'm going to take a quick step away from efficient coding, but this is also interesting. So there is typically in this kind of experiment, there is a compression across numbers. So the subject exhibits a compression of the number line, so something related to Weber's law, which means that essentially the participants are more imprecise for larger numbers than for small numbers. And so here I'm looking at on a log scale at the response variance versus the number, and also on a log scale. And once again, there is inter-subject variability. And to capture this variability, I'm going to do a simple linear regression of those 2 quantities, so the variance versus the number. So this is, once again, just looking at behavioral responses, and this is looking at the fMRI-derived responses. And once again, there is this inter-subject variability, but we recover the same ordering of this kind of compression pattern across subject. And if we look at all the subjects, we find a significant correlation between those 2 measures of compression as measured with the fMRI data and as measured with the behavioral data. And so the participants whose neural population shows stronger compression across numbers also exhibit a stronger behavioral compression. So to recap, the numerosity sensitive population in human parietal cortex adapt their tuning to the contextual statistics of stimuli. The observed adjustments in tuning are consistent with this hypothesis of distributed range adaptation, which posits that receptive fields shift and encode stable quantities across context. And now the encoding precision decreases under the wider prior, consistent with the dynamic implementation of efficient coding, and that was observed both in fMRI and behavioral data. And last but not least, there is correlation between the two. So the individual differences in this neural adjustment correlate with individual differences in response variability, which perhaps suggests that one underlies the other, of course. And so there are many open questions for the future. One question is this hypothesis, this mechanism of distributed range adaptation, is it a standard mechanism of encoding networks? So can we find it across species and across different sensory modalities? What are the implications of this flexibility of the neural code for decision making, and maybe, for instance, for risky choices? Also, what is the role of this for pathological decision making of the kind that we can find in gambling and in addiction? And it might be the case that a breakdown in distributed range adaptation could underlie a distorted representation of magnitudes, of probabilities, of values that in turn would yield such a pathological decision making. Thank you very much. You can find a preprint for this project on bioRxiv.